speaking of military industrial complex, if you have not heard, Victoria Nuland has decided to resign during a time when some people say that it is pivotal in reference to the Ukraine war. Oh, she sure knows how to pick the timing, right? Victoria Nuland, third highest ranking U.S. diplomat and critic of Russia's war in Ukraine, is retiring. I think I may have said resign. I meant retiring, excuse me. Nuland, a career Foreign Service officer who served as Assistant Secretary of State for Europe during the Obama administration, but retired after Donald Trump was elected president, returned to government as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs in the Biden administration. So what this tells me, folks, is two things. One, Victoria Nuland must be thinking that Trump is going to win in November. Because remember, it said that she was actually a part of the Obama administration. I think she also worked during the Clinton. I thought she worked under the Clinton administration too. But the moment when Donald Trump won, she decided to step down. Then she reappeared again under the Biden administration. And now she is choosing to retire. So that tells me that Victoria Nuland may believe that Donald Trump is going to win in November. And two, this war in Ukraine. Right now, things are not looking favorable in reference to Ukraine. There are politicians in Congress debating whether or not to continue sending funds to Ukraine, and some of them are against it. So there's that too. And it's obvious that Ukraine does not stand a chance here in reference to winning this conflict, right? It's gotten to the point where even France is talking about possibly sending their soldiers to help Ukraine. So now she is choosing, let me get out of here before things get crazy in November. Nuland had served at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in the tumultuous 1990s and was in the city during the attempted coup against former Russian President Boris Yeltsin. She then became U.S. ambassador to NATO before being tapped to serve as the State Department spokeswoman under former Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton during President Barack Obama's first term. I'm going to go ahead and bring up this part here. As the department spokeswoman and later as Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, Nuland drew the ire of many Russian leaders for her outspoken defense of Ukraine, particularly after Russia annexed the Crimea Peninsula in 2014. So you got to remember which side that she is on. She heavily supports this war. She heavily supports the U.S. government funding Ukraine. And she's been after this since 2014. She is a war hawk. Former Secretary of State John Kerry has recalled on numerous times that when Nuland left the spokeswoman job during his tenure to become the top diplomat for Europe, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei congratulated him for getting rid of that woman. Kerry said he replied that he didn't get rid of her. I promoted her. Current Secretary of State Anthony Blinken praised Nuland for her 3.5 decades of public service and thanked her for her role in shaping U.S. policy around the world under 6 presidents and 10 secretaries of state. Think about what that statement says, shaping U.S. policy around the world. In other words, we're talking about imperialism. We're talking about policing these countries. And we're also talking about removing leaders from other countries. That's really what he's saying. And I want to highlight this part here as well. It says the Russian Foreign Ministry immediately seized on the announcement, calling it an admission of failed U.S. policy towards Russia. And I agree, because what this tells you is that she realizes that Ukraine cannot beat Russia. She realizes that this is a failed war for Ukraine. She also realizes that it looks like, or it could be possible, that Donald Trump actually could win again in November. And if that takes place, remember, Donald Trump said he does not support the war in Ukraine. He would try to end it immediately. You have to take that with a grain of salt, but he's more likely to do that than Joe Biden would, right? So that being said, that would not be good for someone like Victoria Nuland. So she's trying to get out of there quickly. Now, Glenn Greenwald, he had some things to say about Victoria Nuland. Always like pay attention to exits, like when people choose to retire or when they choose to resign, and how it aligns with everything else that's happening at that point in time. Check out what Glenn Greenwald had to say.
One of the most bloodthirsty and psychotic warmongers to occupy high office in Washington resigned today, evidently and hopefully bringing a shameful end to her long and destructive career in Washington. Victoria Nuland, who worked for every American president from Bill Clinton to Joe Biden, with the sole exception that she was out of power only during the Trump presidency, announced today that she was resigning her position as acting Deputy Secretary of State, a position to which she had just been promoted last July when the prior Deputy Secretary of State retired. There's much speculation about why Nuland may have resigned now. Perhaps it was due to her anger that the Biden administration is not doing more to fuel the war in Ukraine against Russia, one of her pet projects for decades, though the Biden administration is impeded only because Congress, under House Speaker Mike Johnson, won't approve another $60 billion for that war. Perhaps it is anger over the fact that the Biden White House is now tepidly criticizing Israel, a country to which she is more devoted than almost anybody in Washington. Or perhaps, and most likely, it was due to the fact that she was just passed over to permanently become the Deputy Secretary of State, the position second in line to ascend to her lifelong ambition of becoming Secretary of State. Whatever the reasons, and despite the horror show that has already replaced her, someone who also worked for Dick Cheney and has been around the State Department for decades, there is still much to celebrate from this news of the end, at least for now, of Victoria Nuland's career in government. She served as Dick Cheney's top advisor for his disastrous invasion and occupation of Iraq. She then served as U.S. ambassador to NATO when the Bush administration, led by Condoleezza Rice and Victoria Nuland, began attempts to expand NATO right up to the Russian border, including Ukraine. And one can draw a direct line between that expansionist mentality in 2007 and 8 and the decade-long war in Ukraine now taking place. She then ran Ukraine for the Obama administrations under Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, where she became one of the most extremist voices in Washington for placing the U.S. on a confrontational, provocative course with Russia. And then when Joe Biden replaced Donald Trump, one of the first things he did was immediately hire her to run Ukraine for his administration. In 2014, a conversation that Nuland had with the then U.S. ambassador to Ukraine was tape recorded and leaked, allegedly by Russia, in which the pair were caught plotting who should be chosen to rule Ukraine, who was best for the United States, in the wake of the U.S.-supported coup in 2014 that succeeded in removing Ukraine's democratically elected president. While Nuland, in one sense, is merely one of the most extremist representations of the bipartisan machine of endless war that has ruled D.C. for decades at the expense of ordinary Americans, she is also a singular menace and ghoul.
Let me pause here for a second. When you look at what's happening in Ukraine right now, one of the people that you have to point fingers to in reference to that is Victoria Nuland. You see, a lot of times it's easy to point fingers at the military, but it's easy to point fingers at the president as well. But sometimes you have to look at the people that are around them. You have to look at like the Anthony Blinkens. You have to look at the Victoria Nulands. These are the people that oftentimes I think the everyday American is not paying attention to. The president is always the face that's out in the front. But we have to start looking at the faces that are behind the president that you don't actually hear from as much. It's people like her. People like her that push these wars. Remember what the article said. She started to have a stake in Ukraine in 2014 after Russia annexed Crimea. So this has been going on for a long time. It was only a matter of time before this war was going to kick off.
Nuland's pedigree is itself revealing. She married into the largest and most toxic neocon dynastic family. In the 1990s, she married Robert Kagan, who for decades was the principal partner of Supreme neocon Bill Kristol, having worked with him in the 1990s to create the leading neocon group Americans for a New Century, which spent years before 9/11 urging the U.S. government to invade Iraq and remove its government. According to Politico, which named the couple among the top 50 most powerful people in Washington in 2014, Nuland and Kagan, quote, fell in love talking about democracy and the role of America in the world on one of their first dates, end quote.
So think about what Glenn Greenwald just said there. At one point, her and her husband were named as the most powerful people in Washington, D.C. What does that tell you? That's never a good thing, by the way. If someone says that you are the most powerful, one of the most powerful people in Washington, D.C. That's actually not a compliment. That means that you are corrupt. That means that you are probably in bed with some type of lobby, probably the Israeli lobby, the military industrial complex. That means that you were able to skate by and get to that spot because you went along with what the State Department wants to happen. And you probably killed some people abroad.
That is neocon speak for invading foreign countries and changing their governments. Kagan's father, his brother, and his sister-in-law are all leading neocons in Washington, always sending other people's families to fight in one war after the next after they architect and sell those wars to the American public while never fighting in any of them themselves. Nuland's status as both a singular force for war and destruction, and her status is one of the most vivid symbols of how bipartisan and insulated from elections is this warmongering ideology, makes her particularly worthy of examination, especially upon her glorious resignation, the final end to her bloodthirsty reign. Understanding her trajectory is vital to understanding how Washington really functions.
That's right. Again, how does Washington function? It's not by or because of the president. They usually try to remove those that try to do those types of things. It's usually because of the people like Victoria Nuland and people like Antony Blinken, the Pentagon members. I want to show you this speech from Victoria Nuland. This was just 10 months ago. Says Secretary Victoria Nuland's keynote address on unleashing market potential in Ukraine. Check this out. Most people probably haven't seen this.
Marjorie, for the kind introduction, and thanks especially to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for working with us to organize this critical forum today. I am honored to participate in this meeting along with Commerce Secretary Raimundo, USAID Administrator Power, Undersecretary Fernandez, my colleague at the State Department, and so many others from the interagency. And it's also a pleasure to have Prime Minister Shmyhal and other Ukrainian ministers here in Washington with us, along with our fabulous Ambassador Makarova. I know you're here, I can't see you. And an incredible group of leaders from across civil society, the NGO world, international business, working towards a better future for Ukraine, for the US-Ukraine relationship, and for our world.
Now, let's just pause there. Think about the people that she just mentioned, okay? You and I would never be invited to this talk. She's talking about world leaders, NGOs. Pay attention to who was actually present at these events.
As President Biden said in his State of the Union address in February, Putin's invasion has been a test for the ages, obviously for Ukraine, but also a test for America and for the world. Putin's cruelty and depravity, his willingness to sacrifice the men, women, and children of Ukraine, and even so many of his own citizens, threatens not only Ukraine, but the very order of our world.
Now remember, because she leaves this out on purpose, remember what we found out from that interview with Vladimir Putin and Tucker Carlson, which is that the US government and NATO actually implemented a coup. So don't forget that. Before this war began.
A little more than a year ago, the question was, would we meet this moment? Would we together defend the most basic principles of sovereignty, freedom, and democracy? Would we protect the international order that was built on the ashes of World War II and rooted in the rule of law and the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states?
When she talks about World War II, notice that she's leaving out the fact of who actually fought against the Nazis in World War II. Who fought against them? She's talking about Ukraine. We're talking about the fact that they have soldiers in the Ukrainian army that have Nazi symbols on their uniforms, right? She's going to leave that out, right? So you did this, Victoria. You went there. You brought up World War II. So you started this. So we're going to take it there. So she's conveniently leaving that out, conveniently leaving out the Nazification in Ukraine, the country as a whole, not just those soldiers that are part of the Azov battalion. But she brought up World War II. Didn't the Russians fight against the Nazis in World War II? Okay.
A world order that ushered in the greatest period of economic progress in human history. Billions of people brought out of extreme poverty and hunger, unprecedented advances in global health, longer life expectancies, and an end to the cycle of bloody European land wars. Oh, wait, until now. Or instead, would we allow a revisionist despot like Vladimir Putin to rip out the foundations of the order that we worked so hard to build?
It's interesting. You know, we really, let me not say we, she really has no room to talk about countries taking land, considering the fact that the US government has been doing this for how long? So the way that they try to paint Russia, it's really interesting to me because Russia doesn't have bases all over the world. The United States government does. That's our military that has bases all over the world. It's our government that has been invading these countries. It's our government that has put sanctions on a lot of these countries throughout the world. But let Victoria Nuland tell it. And this is not to say Vladimir Putin is perfect. He's not. He has his flaws, his faults as well. But Victoria Newton is pretending like Vladimir Putin is way more powerful, has done way more damage to these countries than the United States government has. That's the hilarious part to me. And you have to connect the dots. This is all about money. It's profitable for the military industrial complex to have war. Peace is not profitable. That's what this is really all about.
And if Putin were to succeed, what would that signal to other despots around the world with similar coercive toolkits and territorial ambitions of their own?
You mean like Israel? See, this is how you can call out the hypocrisy, guys. You mean like Israel, like the state of Israel, how they've taken over, right? They kicked the Palestinian people out, pushed them into Gaza, now committing a genocide in Gaza, kicking Palestinian peoples out of the West Bank and building illegal settlements. You mean like Israel? But she won't mention that either, because her and her husband are Zionists.
14 months into this conflict, the answer is clear. To quote Prime Minister Shmihal, we are united in defense today, and we will be united in recovery tomorrow. The American people have provided extraordinary levels of military, economic, and humanitarian support to Ukraine. In solidarity with Ukraine, we and our allies have said no to Russia's brutal invasion and helped Ukraine push it back. We've said no to Putin's nuclear blackmail, no to the weaponization of food and energy, and no to the gross human rights abuses and war crimes inflicted daily on the Ukrainian people.
You didn't say no to those things in reference to Israel, though. When we talk about the humanitarian aid, when we talk about the brutality that's happening there, notice how, like I said, once again, this is how where you can catch them, right? Notice how when it comes to Ukraine, when these things were happening to Ukrainians, we got to do everything that we can to help them and save the people. We got to give them humanitarian aid immediately. We got to send billions and billions of dollars to Zelensky immediately. You guys know it's gotten to the point in Ukraine where they're actually asking women to fight because they're running out of the male soldiers. Do you know that? You know, when Ukraine wanted something, let's just jump to the eat. And by the way, Ukraine is not a part of NATO. So what's it really about? The US government can't say, whoa, it's a NATO country, we got to help them. No, they're not a NATO country. No, they're not. But when you make that same comparison to what's happening to the Palestinian people, what Israel was doing to the Palestinian people, it's the exact opposite response from the US government. I hope more people see this.
The United States has not wavered in our response to Putin's war, and nor have our allies. We are more united than ever. And we, here in Washington, led by President Biden, will continue to ensure the free world supports Ukraine for as long as it takes.
What do you mean by the free world? Like when people make this phrase, they say this phrase, the free world. What do you mean? I never understood that. The free world will not tolerate this. You mean to tell me there's parts of the world that aren't free? You mean to tell me there's parts of the world where people are still in bondage or people are enslaved? They kill me when they use this term, the free world.
Why? Because the American people understand the stakes that might cannot be allowed to make right. Not in Ukraine, not anywhere. Thanks to the bipartisan support of Congress, the American people have already provided over $50 billion in military, economic, and humanitarian support. But equally importantly, we've helped galvanize our partners and allies around the world to do the same. Europe alone has contributed another $50 billion across all lines of effort, in addition to welcoming 8 million Ukrainian refugees. And it's important for Americans to remember that in European homes across the continent, Ukrainians are finding refuge.
Pause. That's the part where I wanted to end right there with her speech. You see how they were able to take in Ukrainian refugees? All across the world. She said all across Europe as well. We've taken in Ukrainian refugees. Notice how they didn't really bat an eye in reference to that. Again, not a NATO country. They've asked to be a part of NATO, but they're not a NATO country. Remember when JB and I reported the story that there was even HBCUs that were giving Ukrainian refugees free tuition? Hampton University, Virginia. See how they're able to just take them in like that? Right? But check this out. Not willing to do that in reference to the Congolese people, the Palestinians. It's interesting who they're willing to take in as refugees. Don't forget Bosnia. Remember the Bosnian genocide? We took in Bosnian refugees here in the United States. So that's something I want you to pay attention to, that Victoria Nuland, this entire speech is a walking contradiction in reference to how our government has handled the situation with Israel and Gaza. A walking contradiction. This is why you cannot take them at their word. People continue to say, Noel, who may be still in the chat, has said, oftentimes we live in a plantation nation. It's interesting how they're willing to bend over backwards for European countries. But when it comes to countries in Africa, when it comes to the Palestinian people, when it comes to other countries in the Middle East, unless it's Israel, not willing to bend over backwards for those people, they're willing to put sanctions on those people and make their life worse than it already is. They put sanctions on Afghanistan, Yemen, Haiti, all across the world. Look it up. How many countries the U.S. has put sanctions on? And the reason why they have this resentment for Russia is because economically, Russia seems to be doing okay, even though they put sanctions on Russia. And Russia is a force to be reckoned with. That's a competitor economically for the United States, same with China. But other than that, they're not really trying to help people across the world that really need that help unless they are European. Pay close attention to that.